One was called too stubborn to be a wife, the other too slow to ever lead. Together, they built a future no one saw coming. When Clara Whitmore stepped off the stagecoach, the man who promised her marriage rejected her on sight, called her difficult, sent her away like a mistake. She had nothing, not even a roof. Bo Ramsey watched from the shadows, a quiet man, raised without books, taught that his hands were for labor, not for building dreams. They had no reason to trust each other, but when no one else believed in them, they believed in each other. This is the story of two outcasts who found courage, not in love first, but in respect, and from that respect, they created a school, a home, and a legacy that changed a town. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, this story is for you. Tell us in the comments who stood by you when no one else did. Now, come hear the story of the woman who was too stubborn and the cowboy who saw that as her greatest strength. She stepped off the stagecoach with hope in her eyes and no one waiting to catch it. The wheels groaned to a stop, kicking up a fine red dust that clung to everything: faces, skirts, and the promises people brought with them. Clara Whitmore clutched her small, weather-worn valise. Leather cracked along the seams. The metal clasps dulled from years of use. Her gloves were damp with nervous sweat despite the mountain air, and beneath her modest blue traveling dress, her knees felt unsteady, like she wasn't quite sure the earth beneath her belonged to her anymore. Copper Hollow, Colorado, elevation unknown, population uncertain, possibility she had hoped, unlimited. She had imagined stepping down into a warm smile, maybe a small bouquet of wildflowers in a rough hand, a man, Ezekiel Graves, tipping his hat with awkward sincerity, saying something like, "You must be Clara. Welcome home." Instead, there was no one. A wiry man in suspenders and a worn hat hauled down her trunk with a thud that made her wince. "Last stop," he muttered, already turning to see to the other passengers. Clara stood still for a moment, squinting against the sun. The main street was wide and empty, flanked by dusty storefronts and rough plank sidewalks. A tumbleweed danced lazily past the wheel of the stagecoach. A woman behind her nudged past, reunions blooming around them, hugs, laughter, voices raised in joy. But for Clara, the silence was deafening. She stepped forward, shoes crunching on gravel. A man emerged from the shadows of the mercantile, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark coat stiff with trail dust. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low and had a child clinging shyly to his leg, a boy, perhaps 7. Clara's heart leapt, then faltered. The man did not smile. He didn't approach. "Clara Whitmore," he called, as if confirming a shipment. "Yes." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He nodded, slow and reluctant. "Ezekiel Graves." She took a hesitant step toward him, trying to offer a small smile. "It's good to finally meet you, Mr. Graves. Your letters." He cut her off with a glance. "You're not what I pictured." The boy at his leg tugged on his pant leg and whispered something. Ezekiel ignored him, studying Clara like a slab of meat at the butcher's counter. She felt her stomach tighten, her throat dry with sudden dread. "I mentioned my age and background in every letter," Clara said, more to fill the silence than to defend herself. "And you sent for me after." "I know what I said." His voice was clipped. "Didn't expect you to look so capable." Capable, Clara blinked. "I beg your pardon." Ezekiel shook his head, looking past her like she was a burden he now had to explain. "You stand like you own the place. That ain't becoming." A few townspeople had begun to gather, shopkeepers lingering in doorways. a pair of women pretending to adjust their bonnets while listening. Clara's cheeks flushed. "I made this journey under the understanding that I would become your wife." "That we were," he interrupted again, this time more loudly, his voice carrying. "She's not what I ordered." The words rang out like a bell. A ripple moved through the crowd. Someone whispered. A man chuckled. The boy beside Ezekiel looked up at Clara with a mix of confusion and pity. Clara felt the burn rise from her collarbone to her temples. She stood still, fighting the sting behind her eyes, refusing to lower her gaze. A woman in her position wasn't supposed to speak back, but she wasn't sure she had the strength to remain silent. "You invited me here," she said, softly but clearly. "You wrote to me. You said you wanted someone educated, practical, willing to work hard and raise your children. I gave up everything back east for the future you promised." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. "I don't need someone with opinions. I need a woman who listens. You came all this way, Miss Whitmore, but I reckon you'll be happier finding a place that suits." "You're kind." The boy tugged his sleeve again. This time, Ezekiel turned and walked away, boots thudding against the boardwalk. The boy looked back once, his small face uncertain, before following. Clara remained standing in the center of the road, dust swirling around her hem. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her valise. No one moved to help. No one offered a place to stay. No one said a word. She didn't cry. Not yet. She simply turned slowly, her skirts catching in the mountain wind, and walked toward the edge of the street, past the staring eyes, past the whispers, until she stood alone at the corner of the general store, where the shadows fell long and cool against the wall. She had traveled over 1,500 miles for a man who decided in under 5 minutes that her strength made her unworthy. And now she had no home to return to, no savings left, and no plan B. The church bell rang the hour noon, high sun, long shadows, and Clara Whitmore stood where the road ended, holding the frayed edges of what was left of her hope. The wind carried voices behind her, laughter from the saloon, the clatter of hooves, but Clara heard only the silence inside her. She would not beg. She would not run. But where? In a town that had already decided who she was. Could she begin again when you have no place to go? Even a cold barn feels like shelter. The shadows had grown longer by the time Clara made her way up the narrow porch steps of the Copper Hollow Hotel. Her boots, polished that morning, were now coated in red dust. She straightened her shoulders, brushed her skirt with the side of her hand, and opened the creaking door to the front office. A bell chimed overhead, and a man with graying hair looked up from behind the counter. His eyes moved over her like he was measuring fabric. Not hostile, just indifferent. "I need a room for the night," Clara said, voice soft but clear. Nothing fancy, just somewhere to rest. The man studied her again. "You alone?" "Yes." "No husband?" "No." He sighed, tapping a ledger. "We don't normally rent to unaccompanied ladies, not unless it's a family arrangement or prearranged by a local sponsor." "I'm a teacher," Clara offered quickly. "I came here under a marriage agreement, but it fell through." His eyes narrowed. "Ah, you're that mail-order bride, the one Graves sent packing." Heat flushed her face. "I wasn't sent packing." He decided she stopped. What would be the use? The man gave a tight shrug. "Rooms are for respectable guests. Best speak with the livery. They've got some storage space out back. Might be better suited." Clara turned without a word. She passed 3 women on the steps, all pausing in conversation to glance her way. One offered a thin smile, almost pitying. The other two didn't even pretend to be subtle. Down the alley beside the hotel, the smell of manure and old hay hung heavy. A woman in a dark shawl was feeding chickens near a slant-roofed shed. Her hands were gnarled with age, but she moved with surprising purpose. Looking for something, the woman asked. Clara hesitated. Just somewhere to sleep. The woman didn't flinch. You the Boston girl, Pennsylvania, Clara corrected gently. Clara Whitmore. The woman studied her for a long beat, then nodded toward the side of the barn. You're clean, quiet. That's more than I can say for half the men in this town. You can stay in the storage room. No charge, but you'll help with feed in the morning. Clara blinked. Truly, I thank you. Don't thank me yet. Rats think they own the place. Inside, it was cold. The straw was old and the air stale, but there was a worn cot, a blanket that smelled faintly of horses, and a bit of quiet. She sank down, fingers trembling not from fear, but exhaustion. She hadn't eaten since sunrise. The next morning, Clara tied her hair in a neat knot, dusted off her dress, and stepped out into the clear light of a Colorado dawn. The mountains loomed in the distance like silent judges. She spent the day walking the narrow lanes of Copper Hollow, knocking on doors. The schoolhouse, a two-room cabin at the edge of town, was her first stop. She explained her experience, offered to volunteer until a position opened. Minister's wife already teaches, the man in charge said flatly. We don't need fancy back east methods confusing the children. The bakery wasn't hiring. The milliner said she didn't need help. The general store's owner looked her up and down before stating bluntly, I don't hire single women. Single. Clara thanked each person with steady grace, but with every door closed in her face, the weight on her shoulders grew heavier. She'd thought rejection would sting less after the first, but it didn't. It built upon itself, like dust piling into drifts. By late afternoon, her feet ached. Her stomach turned on itself with hunger. Still, she returned to the hotel, hoping perhaps a shift in mood had occurred. The same clerk stood at the desk. He raised an eyebrow as she entered. I'd like to offer to clean rooms, she said, voice firm, or help with laundry. I can cook, so I just need honest work. He tapped a pencil on the counter, then leaned in, lowering his voice. Ma'am, he said, the saloon down the street is always hiring. Women with your situation can make decent money. Tips are good. That is if you don't mind what comes with it. Clara froze. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Think about it. She turned and walked out without another word, heart pounding. It wasn't the first time someone had made that kind of suggestion to a woman alone, and it wouldn't be the last. But it burned differently when you'd come to build a life and found yourself offered a piece of one, sliced and soiled. That night, back in the cold shed. Clara lit a small candle and pulled out a page of stationery she had tucked between her books. The paper was creased, corners bent from travel. She dipped her pen, the ink pooling in her hand from the evening chill. Dearest Mother, she wrote, I arrived safely, though things have not gone as planned. She paused, staring at the flickering flame. The man I came to marry changed his mind upon meeting me. He said I stood too straight, spoke too clearly, thought too much. She stopped again. What was the point of telling her mother any of this? Would it ease anything? Would it make the distance feel less? Her hand trembled. The candle flickered lower. I will find a way forward. I must. But when she reached the line that said, Love, Clara, her vision blurred. A tear fell, staining the ink. Then another. She pressed her palm against her mouth to keep from sobbing aloud. She did not send the letter. She folded it neatly, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it under her pillow of straw. Some things, even pain, must first be buried before they can be shared. In the quiet of the barn, with only the sound of wind and distant hooves, Clara resolved one thing: she would not accept pity. Tomorrow, she'd try again. Somewhere, someone must still value strength over silence. Sometimes, help arrives without a white horse, just quiet eyes and a kind offer. It was the third morning Clara had walked the same road into town, boots thin at the soles and dress hem stained with barn dust. The chill hadn't lifted from the mountain air, and neither had the weight in her chest. But she held her chin high as she approached the Copper Hollow Hotel once more, not with hope this time, but determination. Inside. She stood at the counter once again, facing the same clerk who now greeted her with a smirk more than a smile. "I've come to ask again," she said, "if I could clean rooms in exchange for a few meals and perhaps a cot. I'm not asking for charity, just a chance." The man barely looked up. "As I told you yesterday." "I know," Clara interrupted, calm but firm. "But things can change in a day. You might have more laundry, a sick cook, a broken window." Behind her, a tall man in a worn trail coat and dusty hat leaned on the doorframe, arms crossed. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but her tone, polite but unyielding, had caught his attention like a sudden gust of wind on a quiet trail. Clara sensed his presence but didn't turn around. "I've worked in schools, kitchens, and libraries," she continued. "I can read, write, sew, cook, and fix broken hinges if need be. You'll get more from me than you expect, and I won't complain." The clerk shook his head slowly. "We're not hiring. Miss Whitmore." Clara didn't sigh, didn't drop her gaze. She simply gave a small nod and turned to leave. And that's when she locked eyes with the stranger by the door. He was tall, but not imposing. His face was tanned from sun and wind, the lines at his eyes suggesting more squinting in the light than smiling in laughter. His hands, resting on the doorframe, were rough and wide, fingertips marked by years of honest labor. But it was his eyes that stopped her blue-gray like the sky before a storm, but kind, quietly kind. He stepped aside to let her pass, tipping his hat with a murmur. "Ma'am." Clara nodded in return, not expecting to see him again. She was wrong. That afternoon, she returned to the barn with her sleeves rolled, apron dusted with flour from helping the old woman bake-feed cakes for the chickens. As she scraped remnants from the mixing bowl, a knock sounded at the stall door. Miss Whitmore came a man's voice, calm, deliberate. She turned to find the man from the hotel, hat in hand. He offered a small smile. "Name's Bo Ramsey. I work over at the government stable, few miles past the ridge. Trained horses for the cavalry before they pulled out last spring. Still handle what's left." Clara wiped her hands on her apron. "Good afternoon." "I saw you this morning," Bo said, pausing. "Heard you asking for work." She crossed her arms gently, bracing for the usual follow-up something about saloons or better uses for a strong woman. Instead, Bo continued, "I've got an issue I can't fix. Not with a hammer. Anyway." Clara raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I was never good with books," Bo admitted. "Numbers, maybe. But writing formal letters, keeping ledgers clean, that's beyond me. I manage all right. But the armies started sending new contracts through rail delivery. They want proper documentation, proper spelling." He looked down, then back up again, meeting her eyes. "You seem like someone who might be able to help." Clara blinked. "You want me to write for you?" He nodded. "Sort of. Help keep records, translate the paperwork, pen responses. It's office work, mostly, but honest. I can't pay much, but there'd be meals, and shelter better than this. Her instinct was to question, was it a ploy, a backhanded favor, another form of pity? But when she looked at him, really looked, all she saw was sincerity. He hadn't tried to flatter or coax. He'd simply offered something real. "I'm not looking for rescue," Clara said, not unkindly. Bo tilted his head. "Didn't figure you were." She hesitated, eyes falling to her calloused fingers. "You'd be the first." He didn't smile, but there was warmth in his voice. "That's not true anymore." That evening, Clara walked with Bo to the edge of town, her valise in hand once more. The path turned from packed dirt to open trail, winding past cottonwoods and dry grass. His cabin came into view modest, flanked by a stable and a small office with a crooked chimney and neatly stacked firewood. Inside, the office was cluttered but clean. Papers, contracts, and a leather-bound ledger lay in disarray on a wooden desk beside a dusty ink well. A battered bookshelf leaned in the corner, holding more dust than books. "You'll have your own space," Bo said, gesturing to a small side room with a proper bed and a clean quilt. "It's not fancy, but it's yours." Clara stepped inside, laying her case gently on the bed. The room smelled of pine and old paper. It was warmer than the barn, quieter, too. She turned to face him. "You don't know anything about me?" Bo shrugged. "I know enough. You didn't beg. You didn't break, and you've got more grit than half the men I know." Clara looked at him long and hard, searching for even a flicker of judgment, of superiority, of expectation. There was none, just those steady hands and those quiet, kind eyes. Clara touched the edge of the desk, feeling the rough grain under her fingers. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, she wasn't dreading it. In a small back office, trust is born quietly, steadily, between ink and silence. The office smelled of pine and leather, with faint traces of horses and tobacco lingering in the corners. It wasn't a grand space, just one wide table, an oil lamp, a sagging bookshelf, and an old iron stove that groaned when the fire inside burned low. But to Clara, it was a kingdom of paper and possibility. She began her work on a Tuesday morning, fingers trembling slightly as she opened the first ledger. The entries were written in thick, uneven letters, many crossed out or rewritten in darker ink. Clara recognized the handwriting, not illiterate, but clearly labored. Bo hovered nearby, hat in hand, awkward as a schoolboy being graded. "You'll find a mess," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Didn't think I'd need much of this when I signed on to train horses." Clara looked up at him with a small, reassuring smile. "Then we'll untangle it, one page at a time." She worked in silence for hours that day, organizing stacks of correspondence, separating Army orders from private contracts, and rewriting entries with a steadier hand. Bo drifted in and out, checking on a limping colt, tending the stove, splitting wood. But each time he passed the doorway, his eyes lingered just a moment longer. That night, as she sat by the oil lamp, rewriting a particularly garbled inventory list, Bo placed a tin cup of coffee beside her elbow. "You'll go cross-eyed if you don't take a break," he said, leaning on the doorframe. Clara took the cup, grateful. "Your April looks like apple. For half an hour I thought you were bartering horses for fruit." Bo chuckled. "Wouldn't be the worst deal I've made." It was the first time she'd heard him laugh, and she found herself smiling longer than she meant to. By the end of the week, the office began to look less like a tornado had passed through and more like a place of business. Files were labeled, letters stacked, a proper system emerging from chaos. Clara began to learn Bo's rhythms, the way he paced when trying to remember numbers, how he frowned at maps, how he always stood outside the door a moment before entering, as if hesitant to disturb her focus. And Bo learned hers, that she hummed softly when calculating, that her handwriting changed with her mood, that she never once complained about the cold drafts or the long hours. One afternoon, she found a stack of unopened letters in the bottom drawer. "Why haven't you answered these?" Bo looked over from the stove. Didn't want to write back wrong. She paused. "You mean spelling?" Bo nodded slowly. Never learned proper, never had a reason to. Until this? He didn't say it with shame, just with quiet fact. Clara hesitated, then closed the folder gently. "No one taught you grew up working cattle, moved place to place. Reading signs was about all the reading I ever needed." Something in his voice made her chest tighten. Not pity, but something deeper. A recognition of how many lives had been shaped not by lack of ability, but lack of opportunity. She cleared her throat softly. "Well, now you've got me." Bo smiled faintly. "Best thing I never planned for." As the days passed, the distance between them shortened, not with grand confessions, but with small gestures. Clara began to leave boiled coffee ready in the mornings. Bo fixed the window latch in her room so it wouldn't whistle in the wind. She found herself looking forward to the quiet moments between tasks, the way he'd lean on the doorway. One boot crossed over the other, asking questions about words he didn't know. "Correspondence," he repeated one morning, testing the shape of it in his mouth. Clara nodded. "Letters. Communication. From Latin, actually." Bo raised an eyebrow. "You know Latin a little," she admitted, a hint of pride flickering. "My father believed in education, especially for girls. Said knowledge was armor. Mine said the same about a good pair of boots." Bo said, grinning. "Guess we both listened." They laughed. And for a moment, it felt like the world outside didn't matter. It wasn't romance, not yet. But it was something more real than infatuation. It was trust, seated in long hours and quiet respect. A companionship born not of need, but of mutual steadiness. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast gold across the fields, Clara stepped outside to stretch her legs. She found Bo kneeling by the fence, rasping a hoof file across the shoe of a mare. His sleeves were rolled, forearms dusted in dirt, the back of his neck flushed from work. He moved with precision, not grace, but there was a certain peace in the way he worked, like he belonged to the land, and it to him. Clara stood there, watching silently. The breeze lifted the ends of her hair. Somewhere in the barn, a horse nickered. She didn't call out, didn't interrupt. She simply watched, heart oddly full. And for the first time in weeks, the silence inside her felt less like emptiness and more like space being prepared for something new. Grin. Clara caught herself smiling back and wondered, not for the first time, why does this feel like the beginning of something where society says no? A woman builds something anyway out of chalk and courage. It began with a question. One late morning, as Clara sat beneath the awning of Bo's stable sorting delivery receipts, a girl no older than 7 hovered near the gate, clutching a ragged doll and biting her lip. Her clothes were patched, her shoes mismatched. Clara glanced up. "Are you lost, sweetheart?" The girl shook her head. "Mama said you used to be a teacher." Clara blinked. "I did." The girl stepped forward a little, voice hushed. "Could you teach me? Just letters. Mama can't. She says words don't like her." Clara smiled gently, heart already softening. "What's your name?" "Letty." All right, Letty. Let's start with A. By the end of that week, Letty had brought her brother. By the following week, 3 more children had joined them, one of the blacksmith's boys, 2 from a family that cleaned cabins up by the ridge. All came with excuses, fetching feed, running errands. But they lingered for the chalkboard Clara had repurposed from a crate lid Bo helped her sand down, and for the sound of her voice as she made letters dance into meaning. Classes took place in the corner of the stable loft. The children sat on hay bales, hands smudged with dust and ink, eyes wide with wonder. Clara taught them their names first, then how to write them. Numbers came next. Simple addition scratched into slates, Bo scavenged from the old barracks. Word spread softly, like a rumor whispered into cupped hands. By the 3rd week, there were 8 students. Some came in pairs, others alone. One child brought a potato in thanks, another a jar of marbles. There were no desks, no bells, no permission from any council, just children, eager to learn, and Clara, eager to teach. Bo watched the changes with quiet pride. Every morning he'd help haul hay bales into a neat row, sweep away straw, and leave a tin of water and bread rolls by the stable door. "They look at you like you hung the moon," he told her one evening. Clara tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the chalk dust still clinging to her fingertips. "They look at me like someone finally sees them." Bo nodded. Same difference, but not everyone in town viewed it that way. One afternoon, as Clara was drilling the children on vowels, a shadow darkened the stable doorway. The air shifted. Bo, working nearby, stiffened instinctively. Ezekiel Graves stood with his arms crossed, face drawn tight, eyes burning with something colder than anger control being threatened. "So it's true," he said, stepping inside. The schoolmarms turned stablemate, teaching out of a barn. Clara rose slowly, placing the chalk down. "I'm teaching children who want to learn," she said evenly. "Where I teach them doesn't change the value of what they're learning." Ezekiel scoffed. "It's illegal. No license, no authorization. You've no right. These are children," Clara said. "Not criminals," he sneered. "You think this is about them. You're undermining the town. The minister's wife teaches just fine." "To some," Clara replied. "To those who can pay. These children have no one else." Ezekiel stepped closer. "I'll report you to the council. Have you shut down?" Bo had moved in quietly behind him. "You'll have to get through me first," he said, voice low. Ezekiel turned, startled. He opened his mouth, then thought better of it. He looked back at Clara. "You'll regret crossing me." Clara didn't flinch. "Maybe, but I won't regret teaching." Ezekiel left without another word, boots crunching on gravel. Inside, the children sat still, eyes wide. Clara turned back to them and picked up her chalk. "Now then," she said, her voice steady. "Who remembers what letter comes after M.A. small hand raised, hesitant but proud?" "N exactly," she said with a smile. "And we're not stopping now." Later that night, Clara sat on the stable's edge, watching the last rays of sun light the barn roof in amber gold. The children had long gone home, their laughter echoing faintly down the road. She wiped chalk from her skirt, her body tired, but her heart light. Bo walked over, brushing hay from his sleeves. "He's not going to back down," he said quietly. "I know," Clara replied, "but neither am I." Bo smiled, just slightly. "Didn't think you would." Clara looked toward the loft, where their makeshift classroom lay. A chicken clucked somewhere in the dark. A breeze stirred the grass. "Let him try," she said softly, more to herself than to Bo. "Let him try." in a town where permission had always been a gate locked by men like Graves. Clara had found a way through with nothing but a stick of chalk and a refusal to be told no. When a woman refuses to kneel, a whole town has to choose where it stands. The ripple began quietly, like a stone dropped into still water, a murmur at the mercantile, a sidelong glance at the blacksmiths, whispers over porch railings and sewing circles. In Copper Hollow, where news traveled faster than the wind, it didn't take long before the barn school became the center of every conversation. Some folks admired Clara for what she was doing, teaching children who'd otherwise go without, giving them dignity one letter at a time. Others called it improper, dangerous even, not because of the content, but because of the woman behind it. She had arrived without a husband. She had been rejected, and yet here she was, leading, organizing, influencing. "She don't know her place," muttered the grocer's wife, loud enough for Clara to hear as she passed. "She's making the men nervous," said another, with a strange note of admiration. The school continued, undeterred, but so did the scrutiny. Bo heard it all. When he rode into town for supplies, men he once played cards with fell silent when he entered. Others questioned him outright. "You sure about this?" Ramsey, one rancher, asked as Bo loaded grain into the wagon, "letting her stir up trouble on your land." "You're risking business." Bo wiped sweat from his brow. "I'd rather risk business than my conscience." The man snorted. "There's easier women to defend." Bo fixed him with a calm, steady gaze. "Not better ones." The conversation ended there. And when word came that a wealthy landowner, one of Ezekiel's old partners, wanted to commission a string of cavalry horses, Bo declined the offer. "You're turning down $50 a head," the man gaped. Bo nodded once. "I don't work with men who threaten teachers." Clara noticed the shift, too. Some parents stopped sending their children. One even pulled her boy from class, whispering, "We're not against you, Miss Whitmore. We're just not ready to be for you." Others, however, stepped up. Mrs. Aguilar, who ran the laundry on Willow Lane, offered to mend the children's torn clothes. 2 teenagers started delivering firewood for the stable classroom. And one day, Clara returned from town to find a full crate of chalk and 3 slates stacked neatly at the door with no note. The resistance remained, but so did the quiet support. Then came the twist no one expected. It happened one gray afternoon when Clara stopped by the bakery to pick up day-old bread for the children. As she waited, an older woman in a widow's veil stepped beside her. "You're the one Graves turned away." Clara looked up, meeting the woman's eyes. "Yes, ma'am. I was his wife," the woman said flatly. "The first one." Clara's breath caught. She hadn't known. The woman's voice was low. He didn't like questions, or ideas, or a wife who had thoughts of her own. "I still have the scar from the last time I contradicted him about how to boil beans." The bakery fell into silence around them. A loaf dropped to the floor behind the counter, forgotten. The woman didn't flinch. People think he's respectable, but behind closed doors, his authority becomes a fist. Clara found her voice. "I'm sorry, truly." The woman nodded. "Just don't let him silence you like he did me." She picked up her loaf and left. The silence in the room remained. Clara gathered her bread and walked home, the words heavy but clarifying. She had always suspected Graves feared strong women, but now she understood just how far that fear could twist. That evening, as the barn filled with the usual rustle of hay and children's laughter, Clara taught with renewed purpose. She traced every vowel with pride, read every hesitant sentence with warmth. The past wasn't just hers to carry, it belonged to the women who came before her, and to the girls who now sat at her feet, spelling their futures into being. Bo watched from the shadows, as he often did, leaning quietly against the stable door. He said nothing. He didn't need to. That night, he placed a small oil lamp on her desk, brighter than the old one. "For longer lessons," he said. Clara smiled. "For longer nights, too." They didn't speak of graves or gossip, but in the soft light, something unspoken passed between them, a deepening sense of alliance. 3 days later, a folded letter arrived, sealed in red wax and stamped with the town's insignia. Clara read the contents slowly, eyes scanning each line twice, then a third time. Bo looked up from mending a halter. "What is it?" "The town council," Clara said. "They've invited me to speak about the school, about everything." She looked up, heart steady, voice even. "They want to hear what I have to say." Outside, the wind rustled the prairie grass, whispering of change. And for the first time, Clara felt the town wasn't just watching her, it was beginning to listen. She built a school with nothing, but what she gained was everything. The chapel had long been forgotten, a relic from Copper Hollow's earliest days, leaning slightly to one side, its steeple cracked and bell rusted silent. But beneath the dust and decay, the bones of something sacred remained. Clara stood at its threshold, hands wrapped around a folded letter with the town seal pressed deep in red wax. It trembled just slightly in her grip, not from fear, but from the quiet surge of vindication. The council had said yes. Not all members agreed, of course. Some still eyed her warily. Some murmured about setting a precedent. But the vote had passed, 3-2. The letter was brief. Almost cold permission granted for educational use of the former chapel building, conditional upon proper maintenance and public order. She read it once, then twice, then slowly. She smiled. Bo helped her open the chapel doors that same afternoon. They groaned on their hinges, spilling musty air and decades of silence into the daylight. Clara stepped inside, her boots clicking on the worn floorboards. Dust motes danced like tiny spirits in the sunbeams, breaking through the high windows. "It's perfect," she whispered. Bo chuckled behind her. "You got a loose definition of the word." She turned to him, eyes bright. "It's shelter, and it's space. That's all a classroom ever needs." He nodded, then rolled up his sleeves. Over the next few days, the two of them worked from dawn until well past dusk. They patched the roof with salvaged shingles, scrubbed the pews, replaced broken panes with whatever glass they could find, some clear, some wavy with age. Bo reinforced the sagging beams. Clara dusted and swept, sanded and stitched. The townsfolk watched from a distance at first. Then, quietly, one by one, they began to lend hands. A farmer donated fresh lumber. The baker's wife brought a tin of cookies and a pair of wool rugs. One mother offered her son's old school books, wrapped in twine. And Clara's little school was reborn. The morning of the first class approached like a tide. Clara barely slept the night before, her mind racing with lesson plans and contingency plans. Her satchel sat ready by the door, filled with chalk, slates, spare pencils, and a folded kerchief from her mother's sewing drawer, worn smooth with age. She stepped outside just after sunrise, drawn by the faint clink of metal near the fence. Bo was there, sharpening a blade, polishing a horseshoe, or maybe just waiting. He looked up and gave her the smallest of smiles. "Morning," he said. Clara walked to him slowly, heart already beating differently. She could feel something shifting in the air between them, not dramatic or sudden, but steady, like a wagon finally reaching level ground. "I've been thinking," Bo began. He set his tools aside and turned to face her fully. "About what we are, what this is." She felt a flutter in her chest, but she didn't interrupt. "I've never been the type to say pretty words," he said. "Don't care much for ceremony, but you should know I don't see you as someone I need to save." Her breath caught. "I see you as someone I want to walk beside," he continued, "through all of it, even the hard parts, especially the hard parts." Clara's eyes welled up, but she held them back. "I won't promise to protect you from everything, but I will promise not to stand in your way. I'll stand with you, and if you'll have me, I'd like to build something that lasts. Not just a school, a life." He reached into his coat pocket, not with a box, not with gold, but with a small carved piece of wood, smoothed into a ring, whittled carefully, quietly. "I know it ain't much," he said. Clara took it, her fingers trembling slightly. "It's more than enough." He searched her face. "So, is that a yes?" She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes, but I still want to teach." Bo smiled, eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's who you are." She returned his smile. "And that's who I'll always be." They didn't announce the engagement with fanfare. There were no invitations, no parties, just whispered congratulations, knowing glances, and a deeper sense of belonging that wrapped around Clara like a warm shawl. On the morning of the first official school day, Clara stood on the chapel steps, watching the path fill with life. Children ran ahead of their parents, clutching slates and books. Mothers adjusted bonnets. Fathers stood back, nodding politely. Even a few skeptics came not with apology, but with cautious curiosity. Inside, the rows of hay bales were lined neatly. The blackboard shone, and a basket of apples sat at the front, donated by the orchard owner's wife. Clara took it all in slowly. The sun filtering through the window, the sound of little boots on the chapel floor, the whisper of pages turning. And then she saw him, Bo, leaning quietly against the back wall, arms folded, eyes steady, watching her, not to lead, not to shield, but simply to witness. Their eyes met across the room. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. And as Clara turned back to her students, heart full and spine straight, she felt something settle inside her, not the end of a journey, but the beginning of one built on something stronger than survival. Dignity, purpose, partnership. As Clara raised the chalk to the board and wrote the first letter, A, a hush fell across the room, and in that silence, a new chapter for Copper Hollow had quietly begun. Snow covered the past, but not the fire that had kept her going. By mid-November, the winds had changed. They no longer carried dust or prairie heat, but the crisp bite of winter, laced with pine and silence. The first snow didn't fall so much as settle quiet and steady, like the hush that follows a long cry. Clara woke to find the world outside her window, transformed trees dusted with white, rooftops softened into curves, and the fields blanketed as if the earth itself needed rest. She stood barefoot on the wooden floor of their small cabin, one hand wrapped around a mug of steeped chamomile, the other resting gently over the growing swell beneath her nightgown. Her breath fogged the window pane as she watched snowflakes spin in the wind. Behind her, the wood stove gave a low crackle, casting flickering light on the walls. Bo was still asleep, one arm flung over the quilt, breathing deep and even. She loved watching him like this, unguarded, softened by rest. Marriage hadn't made life easier, but it had made it steadier, and steady. Clara had come to learn, was its own kind of miracle, They had settled into something unspoken, but understood. A rhythm. Days began with shared coffee, hers light and slow, his dark and quick. Bo spent mornings tending the horses, chopping wood, checking fence lines. Clara taught until noon, then cooked lunch, then taught again. Some evenings, she'd read aloud by lamplight. Others, Bo would recite stories he half remembered from his youth, pausing often, letting her help him find the right words. Their laughter came not in bursts, but ripples like stones tossed gently into still water. They rarely raised voices, rarely needed to. Their disagreements on seasoning, on porch repairs, on naming the baby were quiet, even when stubborn, and always followed by a kiss or a shared smile, or a bowl of soup set silently in front of the other. It was not the life Clara had once imagined. It was better. The school had not slowed, even as winter deepened. Children arrived wrapped in layers of wool and joy, boots thudding snow from the steps, cheeks red from the cold. Inside, the old chapel glowed warm with firelight, and the air was filled with chalk dust and the scratch of pencils and the sound of young minds cracking open. But it wasn't only the children anymore. It had started simply Mr. Halvers asking if he could learn how to write a letter. Clara had said yes, and the next week a widow had come, asking to learn how to read her Bible. Then another, and another. By early December, every Wednesday and Friday evening, the chapel stayed lit late into the night, hosting adults with tired hands and hopeful hearts. They came in boots still wet from work, fingers still raw from wind, but with eyes bright with something long buried the desire to know more. Clara taught them patiently, never condescending. She showed them how to hold pencils properly, how to form loops in cursive, how to spell neighbor and dignity and forgiveness. And Bo, though quieter, became their champion. He helped sharpen pencils, warm stoves, steady nerves, and every now and then he'd lean over a shoulder and murmur, "That's it, you've got it." One cold evening, Clara was tending the fire when Bo handed her a letter. Came on the noon stage. He said, "From Pennsylvania." She froze. Her fingers trembled slightly as she took it. It was her mother's handwriting, familiar and sharp. The letter was thin, just one folded page. But when Clara opened it, her throat tightened. "Dearest Clara, we were wrong. You were right to go. We feared the world would hurt you, but instead you've become something stronger than we ever imagined. We've heard of your school, the council's vote, the man who stands beside you. Your father still finds it hard to say aloud, but he asks after you each night. We speak of you with pride now, not regret. If you'll have us, we'd like to visit in the spring. With love." Mother Clara read the words again and again. Then, slowly, she pressed the paper to her chest, eyes brimming but unspilled. Bo sat beside her without a word. After a long moment, she whispered, "I thought they'd forgotten me." Bo gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Some people just take longer to see what's already true. She leaned against him, the firelight flickering across their faces. Outside, snow tapped against the window like a child asking to be let in. Later that night, long after the lamps had dimmed and the fire was low, Clara sat again by the window. The chair beneath her creaked gently as she shifted, both hands now resting over her stomach. The baby kicked, just once. A flutter, a whisper. She smiled. The world was not perfect. It was still cold, still hard in places. But here, in this small pocket of warmth and grace, she had carved out something better, not just for herself, but for the life now growing inside her. She looked out at the white-covered earth and whispered to the future, "You'll be born into a better world. And as Bo's footsteps sounded softly behind her and a blanket draped gently across her shoulders, Clara felt something settle deep within her peace. Yes, but also a fierce, quiet readiness. The girl who was once rejected gave birth to a town's new future. It was just past dawn when Eleanor Ramsey arrived into the world wrapped in cries and winter light, her lungs strong and her fists clenched as if already ready to fight for her place in it. Clara held her close, trembling from both exhaustion and awe. The midwife bustled around the small cabin, whispering to Bo, but Clara heard none of it. All she saw was the tiny bundle on her chest, red-faced, furious, perfect. She named her Eleanor after the teacher who once gave her a book and told her she could be anything. It was the only name that felt right. Bo had cried when he first held her. Not loudly, just a quiet tremble in his throat. One hand gently wrapped around his daughter's impossibly small fingers. "She's got your fire," he murmured. Clara smiled, tired but full. "And your calm." Spring came slowly that year, melting away the last of winter with careful hands. And with it came something new, not just for Clara and Bo, but for Copper Hollow. The school had outgrown the chapel. Word had spread far too far for one woman and a few borrowed slates. Families from nearby farms sent their children. Even a few adults kept coming, sheepishly, in the evenings. And then, one day, a letter arrived. It was from a young woman in Denver, asking if she might come and learn from Clara. She had heard about the barn school turned chapel school. She wanted to teach, but not the way most schools did. She wanted to teach like Clara. By midsummer, there were 3 teachers. By fall, there were 7. Children laughed louder. Books lined the back shelves. Parents lingered after class to ask questions. And Clara, with Eleanor strapped to her chest, moved among it all, part teacher, part mother, part living reminder of what one stubborn woman could build when no one believed in her. Bo, too, found a calling of his own. He noticed it first when helping one of the ranchers pen a letter to his son out east. Then again when a widow asked him to read a legal document she couldn't understand. And again, and again. So he opened a small shop on Main Street. Nothing fancy, just a room with a desk, a lamp, and a sign that read Letters and Ledgers, reading, writing, with respect. He didn't call it a business, he called it a service. People came shyly at first, then steadily. Bo listened without judgment, wrote carefully, and charged only what folks could afford or nothing at all. And each time he looked up from the page to see someone nod in understanding, he felt the same quiet pride he'd felt watching Clara teach her first class. He wasn't just training horses anymore. He was helping people speak. Then came the reckoning. Ezekiel Graves had grown quieter since the council meeting months ago, but he hadn't disappeared. He still walked with his head high, still eyed Clara's school with suspicion, still spoke in corners to men who never quite met his gaze. But the town was changing, and it noticed more than it once had. Rumors turned into whispers, whispers into questions, and questions into records ledgers that didn't match, funds unaccounted for. Land titles suddenly shifted. It was the new school treasurer who brought it forward, one of Clara's former night students. A formal inquiry followed. Ezekiel denied everything. Of course he did. But denial rang hollow now. The same townspeople who once murmured behind Clara's back now stood in quiet groups outside town hall, shaking their heads. He always did have too many pockets in those coats. One man muttered. By autumn, Graves' influence had all but vanished. No trial was needed. No public disgrace. Just absence. And that, somehow, was justice enough. Clara stood in the schoolyard one breezy October afternoon, watching the children tumble through the grass in joyful chaos. Eleanor sat nearby, chubby fingers grasping a wooden toy. Bo leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching it all unfold with quiet contentment. The bell clanged softly in the distance, summoning the afternoon session. Clara didn't move right away. She took a breath, long and full, letting it settle deep in her chest. The wind tugged at her skirts. A child's laughter rang out. Somewhere, a horse nickered, and she smiled, not the smile of relief or even pride, but peace, the kind that comes when you no longer have to fight for your place in the world, because now it stands solid beneath your feet. As she turned toward the door, gathering Eleanor in her arms, Clara looked once more at the field behind her where she had once stood alone with only a suitcase and resolve. And she whispered, "This is what legacy looks like." They once called her too stubborn. Now they call her the woman who changed everything. The train pulled into Copper Hollow with a long whistle that echoed down Main Street, where cobbled sidewalks now replaced dust. Children waved as the steam rose and scattered, revealing visitors stepping out in fine coats, eyes widening at the neat rows of buildings and the quiet pride that lived in every wooden beam. There was a schoolhouse 2 stories tall with a bell that rang every morning at 8. A library beside it, warm and filled with shelves built by Bo and stocked with books donated from Denver, New York, even London. A printing press next door carried the weekly town paper, written by former students who once learned their letters on hay bales. And at the heart of it all stood Clara Whitmore. Though no longer in front of the blackboard, she was present in every page turned, every hand raised, every story shared across generations. It had been 20 years since she stepped off that stagecoach unwelcomed, unwanted, and wholly unshaken. She was older now. Her hair, once chestnut, had silvered at the temples, worn in a bun at the nape of her neck. Her eyes, though lined by time, still held the same quiet fire, the one that refused to dim, even when no one believed in it. She sat most mornings on the porch of the old chapel-turned school, now freshly painted and named the Whitmore Ramsey Academy for Learning and Letters. A small brass plaque hung near the front steps, founded in the name of second chances. And beside her, almost always, sat Bo. His beard had gone gray, his walk had slowed, but his hand still found hers without searching, and his presence, like always, was steady. Eleanor, sharp-eyed, warm-voiced, now taught the youngest students. She had her mother's conviction, but her father's calm. She wore spectacles low on her nose and kept chalk in every pocket. Children adored her. Sometimes Clara watched her from the edge of the field, heart aching with something that wasn't sadness, but a sweetness too deep to name. The girl who was once her infant now stood where Clara once stood, leading, shaping, giving. The legacy was alive, not just in stone or sign, but in laughter, in learning, in lives changed. That fall, the town hosted a celebration for the school's 20th anniversary. Former students returned, many with their own children in tow. Letters arrived from as far as Boston and San Francisco. One came from Pennsylvania, from the daughter of Clara's old teacher, Eleanor Foster. My mother always said her greatest joy was seeing a girl she once taught become someone others would follow. She spoke of you often. She was proud. Clara held that letter close to her chest for a long time, eyes closed, before placing it in a wooden box marked, "For Eleanor." Later that evening, as the celebration quieted and lanterns glowed low, Clara and Bo sat on a bench just beyond the schoolyard. The children had gone home. The air smelled of autumn leaves and distant wood smoke. Bo reached over, brushing a leaf from her shoulder. "You remember when they said you were too stubborn to be anyone's wife?" Clara laughed softly. They said worse than that. He smiled. They didn't know that stubbornness would build a town. She turned to him, eyes full of years and wonder. He leaned closer, voice low and steady. Your stubbornness, they called it a flaw, but I knew all along it was our greatest strength. Clara reached for his hand, held it tightly. There were no more battles left to fight, no more hills to climb. But there was this peace earned, a life well lived. The sun had dipped just behind the ridge, casting the town in gold. From somewhere behind them came the echo of laughter, young, wild, free. Clara looked out at the school, now dimly lit, its windows glowing like lanterns in the dusk. And she smiled gently, fully, without a trace of regret. Her journey had begun in rejection, in loneliness, in a place where her voice had been too much, her ideas too loud, her spirit too unruly. But now she was the woman who changed everything, not by being less, but by never letting go of who she was, not even once. And as the stars emerged above Copper Hollow, Clara Ramsey sat beneath their light, not alone, not silenced, not forgotten, but seen, heard, and, at last, fully home. Sometimes, life doesn't begin with open doors, but with slammed ones. Clara arrived in Copper Hollow unwanted, judged, and alone. Bo had spent most of his life in silence, believing he had nothing to offer beyond hard labor. But together, they proved something quietly profound, that dignity isn't granted, it's built, that love isn't found in grand gestures, but in quiet respect, and that even the smallest acts of courage, teaching a child to read, standing beside someone when it's unpopular, can reshape an entire community. Their story reminds us that being too stubborn can mean holding fast to what's right, that being underestimated is often the beginning of something greater, and that it's never too late to start again with open hands, steady hearts, and the willingness to believe in each other. So if you're feeling unseen, unneeded, or simply tired, remember Clara and Bo. Sometimes the greatest strength is simply refusing to disappear. Thank you for spending your time with us today.
If Clara and Bo's story touched your heart, we'd be so grateful if you'd give this video a like, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to Wild West Echoes for more stories that honor quiet courage and lasting love. Your support helps these forgotten voices echo a little louder.